Have you ever wondered how long the truth can remain buried? In July 1983, a young woman named Teresa Peroni left home and never returned. No witnesses, no screams, no bodies. Only silence. A silence so deep that it swallowed up the years, swallowed up hope, and turned the mystery into an urban legend. For decades, the family waited for an answer. For years, the city whispered theories. Teresa has been forgotten by many, but not by history. In 1997, a human skull was found in a densely wooded area a few miles from where she disappeared. But there was no evidence. Nothing connected the fragment to the missing girl. It was just another unnamed piece in an impossible puzzle. Until, in 2024, science finally spoke. The DNA test confirmed the skull was that of Teresa Peroni. 41 years after the disappearance, the truth began to come out of the grave. But what really happened to Teresa? Why have the threads of this mystery only begun to intertwine now? And the most shocking thing, in June 2025, her ex-boyfriend at the time was indicted for murder. This is not just a criminal case. It's a story about time, about how the truth never completely disappears. It just hides, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Get ready to dive into a true narrative full of emotional layers, historical facts, and discoveries that have spanned generations. If you stay with me until the end, you will understand not only what happened to Teresa, but also how a crime can scream in silence for more than 40 years until it is finally heard. Sign up to continue this journey of forgotten stories, restored voices, and truths that need to be heard. This channel exists to tell what many prefer to bury. It was early July 1983, a time when the world was undergoing quiet changes. Smaller towns still had that conservative air, where secrets were kept behind thin walls and neighbors preferred to whisper rather than get involved. It was in this context that a 22-year-old woman named Teresa Peroni disappeared without a trace. No witnesses, no screams, no bodies, only silence. A silence so deep that it swallowed up the years, swallowed up hope, and turned the mystery into an urban legend. For decades, the family waited for an answer. For years, the city whispered theories. Teresa has been forgotten by many, but not by history. Teresa was a reserved girl with simple habits who worked in a stationery store and lived with her parents. Her days were calm and predictable, with no record of conflicts or suspicious involvements. She usually walked to work, attended a small local church, and was known for always wearing a crucifix around her neck, a symbol of faith that she said gave her peace. That morning seemed ordinary. Teresa left the house saying she was going to meet a friend. She was wearing a light blue blouse, jeans, and the same necklace that had accompanied her since she was a teenager. And then, she never came back. When night fell and she still hadn't returned, her parents became desperate. They looked for neighbors, called acquaintances, and went to the local police station. The response they received was cold. Maybe she left on her own. In 1983, missing adults rarely generated immediate commotion. With no security cameras, no cell phones, no social media, cases like these were treated with a mix of disbelief and institutional coldness. Waiting 48 hours was the protocol. But for the Peronis, every minute was already an eternity. As the days passed, the silence surrounding the disappearance became even more deafening. The authorities kept the case on hold. No clues, no suspicious activity, until a detail began to emerge in family conversations. Teresa, in recent weeks, had been more withdrawn. She had confided in her sister that her relationship with Carlos Henrique, her ex, was strange. "He's been saying things that make me uncomfortable," she said. But it never went beyond that. Like so many women at the time, she swallowed her fear. After all, in 1983, male jealousy was still romanticized. Control was a sign of care. Aggression was seen as passion. Carlos was called to give a statement. He stated that he had not seen Teresa in weeks, that they were separated, that the relationship had ended peacefully. The police didn't insist. There was no search of her home, no alibi checks, nothing that demonstrated any depth of investigation. Teresa simply disappeared, and the world around her acted as if she had dissolved into thin air. The stationery store confirmed that she had resigned a few days before her disappearance, but without further explanation. And so, little by little, her image was erased from public memory. The family, however, did not give up. They put up posters, they knocked on doors, they visited every corner of the city. They even consulted psychics, anyone who promised answers. But all they received was the echo of absence. Not a hair, not a piece of clothing, not a witness. Teresa had been swallowed up by a kind of darkness that makes no sound, only suffering. Carlos moved on with his life. He got married, he moved to another city, he had children, he rebuilt himself. Meanwhile, Teresa's parents languished in the waiting. Her father, increasingly silent, left the house shrouded in silence. Every year, her mother lit a candle on her daughter's birthday, a gesture that mixed longing, faith, and resignation. Her room remained untouched, her clothes folded, her diary closed, as if at some point she might still come back and say, "It was just a nightmare, I'm here." But the reality was cruel. Teresa had not run away. Teresa had not been hiding. Teresa was dead. And what was left of her, although no one knew it, lay silently in a dense forested area not far from where she disappeared. It was there that time decided to bury the truth. The world had moved on, but the secret was still there, intact, waiting for the right time to reappear. Teresa's disappearance exposes something deeper than a simple unsolved crime. It's a portrait of a time when women's voices were muffled by the system, by the customs, by the inertia of institutions. Teresa cried out for help, even if it was with her eyes, with a change in behavior, with that last outburst. But no one listened. And when they finally realized that something was wrong, it was too late. So began one of the most coldly ignored cases of the decade. But Teresa Peroni's story was far from over. The truth, as always, would find a way to emerge. 14 years had passed since Teresa Peroni's disappearance. The world had changed. Technology was beginning to change daily life. Home computers were taking their first steps, and the fear of the millennium was approaching like a strange shadow on the horizon. But in a remote area of dense forest near a rarely used secondary highway, a sinister discovery came to light. It was a sultry late afternoon in September 1997 when two brothers who were exploring the woods in search of wild fruits stumbled upon something strange. A hard, round object partially exposed on the ground. As they approached, the older brother realized that it was not a stone. It was a human skull, yellowed by the time with part of the jaw still attached. It was isolated. No other bones were visible, no tissue, no clear clue as to who that person might have been. Frightened, they ran back to the city and alerted the authorities. The police arrived the next day. Forensics was called, but the case was not given priority. It was just a skull, with no context, no identity, and no apparent urgency. The official records were filed, the fragment was sent to a small forensic institute in the region, and like so many other unidentified remains found over the decades, it was cataloged as female individual, estimated age between 20 and 30 years old, probable death more than 10 years ago. And nothing more was done. The lack of more precise technology at the time prevented more advanced analyses.
There was no national DNA bank. There was no interconnected system for missing persons. Files were still on paper. Cross-referencing data depended on the goodwill and memory of investigators, and in Teresa's case, that memory had been erased. The skull was stored in a cardboard box, numbered and forgotten. The case was never linked to any specific disappearance. No attempt was made to trace cranial traumas. No concrete effort was made to understand why that skull was there, alone. It was just another echo of a life erased among so many others that lie in the anonymity of forensic bureaucracy. Over the next few years, the site where the skull had been found became a dead spot. No more excavations were carried out, no search for additional remains. The forest began to close in again, as if nature itself wanted to cover the wounds of the soil. Meanwhile, Teresa's ex-boyfriend, Carlos Henrique, was building a new identity. Away from the eyes of his hometown, he passed himself off as an ordinary citizen. He had a steady job, participated in the community, and was considered respectable. For him, the past was buried, literally. But science continued to advance, and with it, the ability to hear what time had tried to silence. In 2022, a national initiative to review unidentified remains was created. Forensic teams began digitizing old collections. Each forgotten skull, bone, or fragment would be reanalyzed under new standards. That was how that skull, coldly cataloged in 1997, resurfaced. The process was time-consuming. DNA had to be extracted, genetic markers isolated, and cross-referenced with still expanding databases. And above all, luck was needed. And this time, luck was finally on the side of truth. A strand of hair found near the original box was isolated. The analysis showed a match with a female genetic profile. When cross-referenced with samples from the national database, an alert arose, a potential match with Teresa Peroni, who disappeared in July 1983. Those responsible for the forensic project contacted the archives of the old police station where the disappearance had been registered. With difficulty, they managed to locate a relative who was still alive, Teresa's nephew, who had been born years after the disappearance but had grown up hearing fragments of that never-solved story. He agreed to provide a genetic sample. And then, in January 2024, after 4 decades of waiting, confirmation came. The skull was in fact that of Teresa Peroni. The news came like a bolt of lightning from the past. The city, now transformed, barely remembered her anymore. But the family, still marked by her absence, received the confirmation with a mixture of relief and renewed pain. Now they knew. Teresa was dead, and she had been there the whole time, not far from home. The revelation, however, did not only bring answers. It rekindled questions. How did she die? Who took her to that place? Why did no one connect that find to her disappearance at the time? And above all, why was her ex-boyfriend never properly investigated? When Teresa's name came up again, a new investigation was opened. The skull material underwent more modern analysis. Evidence of a fracture at the base of the skull was detected, consistent with blunt force trauma. The death was not accidental. She had been murdered. That changed everything. The police began to revisit the old files. And when analyzing the statement given by Carlos Henrique in 1983, something curious was noticed. He said he hadn't seen her for weeks, but Teresa's coworkers at the time said she had mentioned an argument with him a few days before she disappeared. Small contradictions began to pile up. Details that had been ignored in 1983 now gained new weight. Psychological profiles were drawn up, old financial transactions were analyzed, and a dark portrait began to form. The discovery of the skull not only proved that Teresa had been murdered, it reopened the path to justice. 41 years later, Teresa's voice, which had been brutally silenced, began to echo loudly. But there were still more pieces of evidence to be found. In the next installment, we'll delve into Carlos's behavior after the crime, the clues he missed, and how he lived for decades carrying a secret that would finally begin to unravel. When DNA results confirmed that the skull found in 1997 belonged to Teresa Peroni, eyes inevitably turned to the man who more than 4 decades ago had been the last person to have an intimate relationship with her, Carlos Henrique. A common name, a common face, but with a past that when viewed in the right light, began to show dangerous cracks. At the time of her disappearance, he was 26 years old, worked as a supervisor in a hardware store, and was known for his reserved temperament. He had never been arrested or reported for any acts of violence, but those who knew him closely remembered an uncomfortable trait, a silent control he exerted over Teresa. Jealousy disguised as protection, harsh comments disguised as jokes, and a way of manipulating conversations that always left him with the last word. In the days following Teresa's disappearance, Carlos behaved with exemplary coolness. He did not cry, nor did he show any public concern. He even attended the symbolic wake organized by the family in 1985, 2 years after her disappearance, only as a discreet presence. At the time, his indifference was attributed to personal grief. Today, it sounds like dissimulation. When the skull was identified in 2024, Carlos was already living in another city with a new family, grown children, and a well-established reputation. But the first questions asked by the team that reopened the case yielded weak answers. The dates he had provided in 1983 did not match the accounts of others. He claimed he hadn't seen her for weeks, but a neighbor of the Peroni family reported that the two had argued on the sidewalk outside their home a few days before her disappearance. The detail went unnoticed at the time. It was not formally recorded, but now, with the focus adjusted, it has become more than noise. It has become evidence that Carlos had lied from the beginning. What's more, when analyzing old files, the forensic team found a diary Teresa had kept for years. In the last pages, she had written short but revealing sentences. "I'm afraid of him. If something happens to me, it's him. He doesn't accept the end." These notes were never officially considered because they were not handed over to the police at the time, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of distrust of the system. But now, added to the context, they reinforced the suspicion. A team specializing in criminal psychological profiling was called in. Based on interviews, they reconstructed Carlos's habits and behavioral patterns over the years, and a pattern emerged: emotional manipulation, control over women close to him, difficulty dealing with rejection. An ex-girlfriend who had a brief relationship with him in 1991 said that he would display outbursts of anger when he felt ignored. On another occasion, a former coworker reported that Carlos would discreetly follow her after work without ever confronting her, behavior that she found strange but never reported. These fragments were not isolated pieces of evidence, but together they painted a grim picture. Carlos's silence of 40 decades was now interpreted not as mourning, but as strategy. And there was more. In reviewing old bank records, investigators discovered that in July 1983, Carlos had made consecutive withdrawals from ATMs on the outskirts of the city, which was out of his routine. In the days after her disappearance, he had been off work for 2 days, officially due to a migraine.
But doctors at the time had no record of any medical care. Everything indicated that something had happened, and Carlos was, at the very least, trying to cover it up. The police then decided to take action. In April 2025, he was called for a new statement. This time, faced with the new evidence, Carlos appeared uncomfortable. He avoided eye contact. His answers were evasive and generic, as if he were repeating an old script. When confronted with the excerpts from Teresa's diary, his expression changed. He didn't say a word for several minutes. He asked to end the conversation. And from that moment on, the investigators understood. They were on the right track. The turning point came weeks later. An anonymous tip reached the state prosecutor's office. The voice on the other end of the line was male, firm but nervous. He said he had seen Carlos arrive in the forest in 1983 driving a dirty car with a distraught expression.
He was a former employee of a local logging company. At the time, he hadn't connected the dots. But now, seeing the news of the case spreading again, the man decided to speak out. The tip was registered and validated. The location he described matched exactly the region where the skull had been found decades earlier. With that, the public prosecutor's office formalized the request for indictment. In June 2025, Carlos Henrique was officially charged with qualified homicide. The prosecution alleged passion, concealment of a corpse, and obstruction of justice. The news caused a national impact. The man who for so long had been considered just the ex was finally the main person responsible for Teresa Peroni's murder. He pleaded not guilty. He said it was all a setup, that there was no concrete evidence, but the tide had already turned. For the first time in over 40 years, justice seemed to be on its way. The courtroom was packed. Every wooden bench was occupied by journalists, curious onlookers, family members, and citizens who, even without knowing Teresa Peroni personally, felt that her story was already part of the city. The atmosphere was heavy. Time seemed frozen. After more than 42 years, her name would finally be pronounced before a judge, not as a cold statistic, but as a real victim of a brutal and ignored crime. Carlos Henrique, now 68 years old, entered escorted by 2 officers. Grim face, calculated posture, gray hair combed with precision. He sat with his hands folded on the defense table, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. The prosecution opened its case with a firm grip. The prosecution did not rely on modern physical evidence, such as fingerprints or cameras, because in 1983, there simply was none. It relied on a patchwork of past negligence that, when pieced together, formed a coherent and powerful narrative. The prosecutor described the discovery of the skull, the DNA match, the inconsistent bank records, the forgotten accounts, Teresa's diary entries, and most importantly, Carlos's behavior before, during, and after the disappearance. She presented the testimony of the former lumberyard employee, whose description of the car and the date matched the location where the skull had been found. What's more, she showed that Carlos never looked for Teresa, did not actively participate in the search, and showed no signs of pain, only distance. The defense, on the other hand, adopted a predictable but dangerous strategy, questioning the reliability of the memories. After all, 42 years had passed. The defense argued that the testimonies were fragile, built on memories corroded by time, that there was no blood, weapon, clothes, or DNA of his at the scene, that there was no confession, that the whole thing was a castle of assumptions sustained by a collective feeling of delayed justice. They argued that Carlos had been the target of prejudice because he was the ex, and that the reports of jealousy were emotional interpretations typical of worn-out relationships. They claimed that the prosecution was trying to punish someone because it was easier to blame a familiar face than to accept that Teresa's killer might never be found. But the prosecution responded with surgical precision. They brought to light something that had been ignored for decades: Carlos's post-crime behavior. Carlos went on with his life as if nothing had happened. He moved to another city shortly after, kept no contact with anyone from his old community, and avoided any mention of the case. When confronted with Teresa's diary in 2024, his silence was not out of shock, it was out of guilt. A specialist in facial microexpressions, consulted during the investigation, appeared in court as an expert witness. He showed, frame by frame, how Carlos reacted when he heard Teresa's name. Small gestures, jaw movements, rapid blinking. Everything indicated internal stress, not from sadness, but from a psychological confrontation with the repressed truth. During the trial, Teresa's nephew testified. He was one of the few living witnesses in the family. He grew up listening to his grandmother cry every night, saw his grandfather waste away in silence, and lived in a house where the ghost of absence was more present than any piece of furniture. In his speech, he did not shout or accuse. He simply said, "My aunt did not have the chance to grow old. He did." The room remained silent for several seconds after his testimony. It was one of the most impactful moments of the entire trial. Other details were revealed. An ex-girlfriend of Carlos, with whom he had a brief relationship in the 1990s, claimed that during an argument he had said the phrase, "I've done things that no one can imagine." At the time, she thought it was just the bravado of an aggressive man, but now it sounded like a veiled confession. The defense tried to disqualify the testimony, claiming bad faith or attention-seeking. But the jury listened and understood. The trial lasted for weeks. The hearings were followed on social media, podcasts, and documentaries in production. Teresa's story had finally emerged from oblivion and entered the collective consciousness. It wasn't just about her. It was about all the women who disappeared, were silenced, discredited. The court wasn't just judging Carlos. It was also judging an entire era that it chose not to listen to. In the final stretch, the prosecutor ended her argument with a phrase that has remained indelible. For 42 years, Teresa was buried without a name. Today, she has a face, a story, a voice. And it is her voice that demands justice. Carlos did not react. He remained motionless. No tears, no words, just the same silence he had maintained since 1983. A silence that now, inside that courtroom, was finally being challenged. The jury retired. They had deliberated for hours. Tension filled the room. When they returned, the verdict was read solemnly. The room held its breath. And then the words came. Guilty of first-degree murder. Carlos Henrique was convicted. The judge set the maximum sentence allowed under the circumstances and the time elapsed, life in prison, with a remote possibility of parole. The sound that followed the sentence was not applause. It was relief, a collective sigh that said, "At last." The verdict had been handed down. Carlos Henrique was convicted. The case was officially closed, but the impact of Teresa Peroni's story was only just beginning. The court closed its doors, but the echo of those hearings spread far beyond the wooden room and the pages of the records. Suddenly, the name of a young woman who disappeared silently in the 1980s began to be repeated in headlines, television programs, classrooms, and support groups for families of the missing. Teresa became a
Symbol of something that goes far beyond a solved crime. Symbol of a truth that refuses to die. In a world accustomed to instant information and disposable narratives, Teresa's story prevailed with a force no one expected. There was something deeply human in that 4-decade silence, something universal, the feeling of injustice, the pain of not knowing, the fear that paralyzes, the collective error of not listening when someone tries, even timidly, to ask for help. The case rekindled an uncomfortable question. How many other Teresas are out there, forgotten in archives, silenced by neglect, ignored by the cold machine of bureaucracy?
Human rights organizations began to cite the case in campaigns to review unsolved disappearances. A foundation was created in Teresa's name, dedicated to the search for missing people and the psychological support of families experiencing suspended mourning. The movement gained traction. In less than 3 months, more than 1,200 cases filed around the country were reopened due to popular pressure. Not because of new evidence, but because there was now a collective conscience that refused to accept silence as an answer. The press, previously dispersed, turned its attention to the structural flaws of the criminal justice system. Teresa's disappearance revealed how, for a long time, the weight of the truth was determined by the institutional will to seek it. And when this will did not exist, due to disinterest, sexism, or sheer negligence, justice became a luxury for the few. Teresa had been ignored because she was a woman, because she was young, because she had an ex-boyfriend who spoke articulately. The system did not protect her. And this was the real trial that began after the case was closed. In the months following the verdict, public schools began to include the case in their educational activities, especially in sociology and ethics classes. Students discussed what it means to give voice to silence, analyzed society's role in perpetuating impunity, and reflected on how collective memory can be a powerful weapon against forgetting. In communities where old cases of disappearances have always been ignored, Teresa's name became the starting point for a retelling of the story, this time with the victims at the center of the narrative. What was most striking was the simplicity of Teresa's life. She was not a public figure, she was not an activist, she was not a celebrity. She was an ordinary woman. And that was precisely what made her story so powerful. Because if even such a simple life can be brutally erased and ignored for decades, it shows that anyone can be a victim of a system that fails to protect, investigate, and remember. Documentaries began to be produced. Investigative podcasts reconstructed the events chronologically, interviewing neighbors, former colleagues, and journalists of the time. One of them gained national prominence, entitled The Silence of Teresa, When Time is the Only Survivor. In its episodes, listeners were taken on an intense emotional journey, listening to letters from Teresa's mother, recordings of interviews with police officers who never seriously investigated, and audio recordings of the trial. Each episode ended with the same sentence: "She waited 42 years. And you, what are you waiting for to hear from the forgotten?" Teresa's story has also led to practical changes. A bill was passed in 2026 that would require all states to review unidentified human remains found before the year 2000 using modern DNA technology. The bill, informally called Teresa's Law, was introduced by a congresswoman who said she reconsidered her own political activities after watching the trial. She said, "I realized I never asked about the missing people in my city. Teresa taught me how to ask." But perhaps the most symbolic moment came months after the trial, when a small ceremony was held at the site where Teresa's skull had been found. The forest was still dense, but now there was an open clearing with a simple memorial, a white wooden cross with a bronze plaque that read, "Here, the silence is broken." Family members, volunteers, and even a few jurors attended. A local pastor led a brief prayer, and then Teresa's niece, who had been born after the crime but had grown up shrouded in its absence, read aloud an excerpt from her aunt's diary. It was a short sentence, written in faded blue ink, but it now carried the weight of 1,000 voices. "Someday, someone will listen to me." And they listened. They listened with their hearts, with justice, with time. Teresa Peroni's story was returned to the world, and with it, the certainty that no buried truth remains dead forever. Teresa could not choose her destiny. She was silenced, buried, forgotten. And for 42 long years, her existence was suspended between memory and denial. But what she left behind was not just a mystery solved, it was a legacy. Teresa taught us that time does not nullify the truth, only tests it. That justice may be delayed, but when it comes, it speaks for all those who have lost their voice. At every step of this story, we have been confronted with human, institutional, and moral failures. The error of not listening, the sin of normalizing abusive behavior, the tragedy of treating a woman's disappearance as a statistic. But we have also seen something greater emerge. The power of memory, the resilience of a family, the courage of a system that, even though it was late, decided to look back and do things differently. If Teresa had been heard in 1983, we might not be here. But if we hear her today, it is because her absence became a cry. And this cry spread. It became a law, a struggle, a seed. Today, other missing women are being remembered, other cases are being reopened, other families who lived in silence for years have hope again. Perhaps the question that remains is this: how many Teresas are still waiting? How many stories are buried in archives, waiting for someone like you to choose to listen? May this story remain as a beacon, simple, small, but firm, amidst the storms of oblivion. And when we remember Teresa, we also remember that justice is not about time. It's about not giving up, about not being silent, and about understanding that sometimes the truth can sleep for decades, but she never dies.